most people at the time didn't really think deep learning was going to work. As soon as I saw it, as soon as I was getting in the weeds, I was like, this is it.
Yeah. What makes a human human?
And I don't think we know. I find it incredibly exciting that we might be able to find out. There's a potential future where AI is better at every task. It's just better at everything.
AI is a huge topic right now, and it spans every industry that we touch. I had the opportunity to sit down with Bryan McCann, and in this interview, we discussed things like his history in building AI and researching in AI since 2012 through Stanford and Salesforce and beyond. We also discussed the differences between machine learning and deep learning. And through that, we came to a conclusion of the similarities between how the human brain learns and how AI models are being architected today. I really hope you all enjoy this interview, and I would love to hear what you think. Well, Bryan, thanks for being here today. I just really am honored that you would come to the small town of Joplin, Missouri to just have an honest and open dialogue with me about AI and human collaboration. And where did you fly in from?
San Francisco yesterday. Yeah, I've been on quite the journey talking to customers in Germany and in London and investor meetings. And then I spent some time in New York. Got 2 nights in San Francisco and came out here.
I want to discuss a little bit about your background, just because I think it's super important to understand that when you're talking about this subject, it comes from a deep knowledge and experience. Mm-hmm. So I know that you graduated from Stanford. You've got a master's in computer science and AI specifically. You've got a bachelor's degree in philosophy. When did you graduate from Stanford?
So I started 2010, finished the undergrad stuff in 2014, and then did my master's for a bit. So I finished everything in 2016.
Obviously, AI is a huge topic right now. AI is something that I think everyone knows. But about 5 years ago, or even less than that, mm-hmm. there was people that probably didn't even know much about the topic at all. Mm-hmm. And so but what we found is there is a small group of people that have been studying AI and been working in AI for a long time before AI became popular. Mm-hmm. And so talk me through like when you first started getting into AI, why you were interested in AI, and just why that was your field of study that was important to you.
I got introduced to AI properly in 2013, and I had been studying philosophy and computer science, but mostly entirely separately. So there was philosophy. I was really interested in meaning mm-hmm. and in the analytic academic philosophy, especially Stanford. Questions of meaning turn into questions of language. There's this like philosopher Wittgenstein who's kind of proposed that most of philosophy was just a bunch of language games. It's kind of us making up our language, and then sometimes we make these puzzles for ourselves just because we can't really define things well enough, or because it's just not precise enough to describe what we're actually experiencing. So that's how meaning turns into language, and language a lot of times turns into like logical stuff, linguistics. But I wasn't super happy with where that was going. I felt like there was a bit of a dead end to the armchair philosophy approach to language and meaning. But on the side, I was doing computer science for fun. Never thought it would be a job. I maybe naively was like, I don't want to sit in front of a computer all day, not realizing most jobs would probably be some version of that anyways. So I thought, okay, if I don't want to just read armchair philosophy on language, what if I started using computers to study language? Went over to the computer science department and started interviewing with different labs and groups. I was trying to do like a summer program.
And what year would that have been? When did that transition?
This is 2013.
2013.
So that's when I got into a...
So we're talking 11 years ago is when you really started to get into AI and start to make that an approach for your future.
They interviewed me. They were very nice, but I didn't know anything about AI. So you can't help us.
Yeah.
But maybe you could work with this guy named Richard down the hall.
Okay.
Richard Socher, who, is my co-founder now, but 11 years ago, he was working on deep learning for natural language processing. Okay. So he was doing the kind of AI that has become super popular now for language. And that was the right
So you and Richard met in 2013 then.
Yep.
So again, for anyone watching this, I just want to make sure people understand this is 11 years ago.
Yeah.
You guys started
Crazy.
on this journey.
Yeah.
And 11 years ago, you got paired with Richard.
Yep.
And you guys started working together on natural language processing.
Yeah. Yeah. And he'd been working on it in his PhD.
Okay.
And he had started to establish that neural networks could be used for language, or like deep learning could be a good approach to doing all the kinds of things with language that people were doing at the time. Machine translation, sentiment analysis, like predicting whether a sentence is positive or negative, a lot of these traditional NLP, natural language processing tasks.
Yeah.
And him and I hit it off pretty much right away. One, because most people at the time, especially around the language aspect of it, didn't really think deep learning was going to work.
Okay.
A lot of those core ideas were being rejected by that community at the time.
Okay.
It was just starting to break through. And I was one of the few people, I think as well, that was like all in. Like, this is totally right.
This is the way.
This is absolutely right.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw it, as soon as I was getting in the weeds, I was like, this is it. This is the best way, actually, to test some of the philosophical hypotheses around language that I read about and talked a lot about, but we could put it in code and try it with deep learning in a way that just made sense.
Interesting. So what would some of those philosophical hypotheses be that you started to see, like, this is aligning at this point?
For example, there were a lot of discussions philosophically around, what is the meaning of a word? Do we define it? Like, if you try to break a word down into definitions, you can like analyze it into maybe smaller, more basic concepts and words. Like knowledge was a classic example. Knowledge could be defined as something like justified true belief. You believe it, it's true, it's justified. But then you can analyze that further, and there's a little bit of like a infinite regress to some extent, or there's counterexamples to all those types of approaches. So an alternative would be to say something like what Sky Firth would say, that the meaning of a word is somehow related to the company it keeps. It's related to the words that often appear around it. So words like red and blue are kind of similar in meaning, at least in some way, because we use them in similar types of sentences and contexts and stuff like that. And then they're different in some ways because of the contexts in which they differ. And the earliest kind of hyped up or like breakthrough demo around some of the deep learning for NLP stuff was these word-to-vec demos, where you could take a word, you could assign it a vector, it's like a list of numbers, and you learn that. You let the deep learning do its magic.
So it's just going through finding all of the connections, the subsequent definitions, and the company it keeps and other ways it's being used.
Exactly. It focuses on that company it keeps part. So you say, if I give you, let's do knowledge again. If I give you the word knowledge, then I'm going to look through a big database of as much text as I can get. What are all the words around knowledge? I'm going to try to predict what those are. Or, given those words, I'm going to try to predict which word this should be. And the answer will sometimes be knowledge. Sometimes it'll be belief. Sometimes it'll be, concepts or something like that. And so when you do this learning process, predicting the context and using the context to predict a word, it turns out you get really interesting word vector.
And when you say word vector, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Because
so
I couldn't tell you what a word vector is.
Well, maybe back up even further. You can like design an algorithm, for example, to look smart. Maybe something that searches for the right path through a maze, or searches for the right moves in a chess game. But the amount of moves you can make in those spaces, in the maze or in chess, are small enough, you can usually just search for the right answer and get the right answer. Then you get to like sometimes more complicated games, and it's harder to search the whole space. You have to get a little clever, make some heuristics.
Yeah. Is that like an exponential problem, essentially?
Yeah.
The more decision points there are, the more outcomes. So therefore, it just gets out of control really quick.
100%. So we think of it as like there's a lot of different states that you can be in. And if you can't memorize them all or compute them on the fly, then you have to start creating these heuristics. Okay, that's kind of the next level in AI.
Which to me seems very much artificial.
It is artificial.
Because it's just a bunch of if-then statements, essentially.
It is,
at
essentially.
a high level.
Yeah. You could say, okay, in this image, is there like a yellow brownish like shape? Is it roughly like an oval of some kind? You could try to go through your head and list out all of the features of that thing that would be relevant to deciding whether it's a hot dog or not.
So it's like a technical guessing game where the answer yes or no helps lead you towards the proper animal if I'm thinking of an animal.
Yeah. Like if you wanted to classify something as a dog too, right? Like, okay, does it look like it has a tail? Is it roughly in this, maybe even like this color scheme, right? So that they could be yes or no. Some of them could be like numbers.
Yep.
Does it have 4 legs? Number of legs, 4.
Yep.
You could list those out. And let's say you list out 300 features to describe a thing. And then sometimes, based on those features, you're going to predict that it's a dog. And sometimes you'll predict that it's not. Maybe you'll predict that it's a cat based on those features. But you decided what those features are. And so each of those features has a number, whether it's a 1 or a 0, if it's yes or no, or some number that corresponds to number of legs or number of eyes or whatever it is. And you can do a lot of machine learning by deciding what those features are and then creating a system that, based on a lot of data, says, okay, based on these features, this is most likely to be a dog or a cat or a bird, whatever.
So you define the attributes. Those attributes will have different priorities as far as the weighting scale.
And the machine learning algorithms get to decide that.
Okay.
That's what we let them decide.
So over time, you're training it with new images, new data, and it's going through categorizing the attributes. And then it's basically saying, okay, this has 4 legs. This is furry. It's got a nose. It has whiskers. No. Well, it's probably a dog.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, when we do deep learning, we don't decide the features anymore.
Okay.
So instead of making a list of 300 things, you just don't do that at all. You say, machine learning algorithm, you get to decide the weighting of these features, but you also essentially get to decide what the features are.
So machine learning, you define the attributes. Deep learning, it's defining the attributes and the weighting scale of how to prioritize it to get to the answer.
Well, what would your feature list be for a word? For like knowledge? What would your 300 features be, or your 1,000 features? Okay, well, it's very helpful to just let the algorithms decide. And this is where you lose a little bit of interpretability too. Because, and this was some of the debate around deep learning as well, this idea of, well, we're not going to know what it's learning. Like, we don't know what it's doing. So now, instead of saying what these 300 or 1,000 or whatever number of features are, we just say, you get 300 numbers, machine, like deep learning algorithm. You get to set them. And I'm not going to tell you what they mean. And you can't tell me what they mean, really.
So you don't even know what they are.
You don't know what they are.
Okay.
But for every word out there, you get 300 numbers to represent that word. Somehow, some way. Or 1,000, or however many you want.
And for those listening, when you say numbers, the decision points in which, like, yes or no, essentially.
Yeah, yes or no, or in the case of word vectors, typically they're just literally any like real number.
Okay.
We call those parameters. These are the parameters that the algorithm can change. And it can move those numbers around to get good at something.
Okay.
And so when you're training something to create a word vector, you're assigning every word in the dictionary a vector. And what I mean by vector, just a list of numbers.
Okay.
So it's just a list of 300 numbers, let's say. 300-dimensional word vector is what we would call that. And you say, okay, if I have this word vector for knowledge, I want to put this into my algorithm and have it predict this word next to it, which is also just a word vector. And I want it to predict this one over here and maybe 2 or 3 away. So just the words around
because
it.
in all the data that it's received, it's learning that when this word is used in this context, here are the possible outcomes or words that follow it.
Exactly. So then it learns to say, well, if I want knowledge to predict the next word, which is going to be justified, and then true, and then belief, then these numbers end up being pretty close to these ones, but not exactly the same. And the magic of it is if you just do that task, if you just predict words around words, then the algorithm will kind of decide to set all these numbers in such a way that words that mean something similar to our eyes, at least, end up close in this way.
What's interesting about that for me is that if you think about humanity and how our vocabulary grows, right? It's by reading, by hearing people, converse with others or converse with us. We pick up on more words. We put more words in our bank. And I wonder, are we creating word vectors ourselves?
I agree.
Yeah.
And that's what I felt in 2013. I was like, this feels right.
Okay.
Yes, there's some maybe Chomskyan grammar in our brain. Our brain is probably set up in some way to be good at this.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it feels like we just pick up language based on context.
So whether you believe it or not, right, the power of shared language existed, way back when. It's documented in the Bible to where they were able to speak the same vernacular, have the same vocabulary. They built a tower to try to reach heaven. And then all of a sudden, boom, confusion exists in the world and shared language was done away with. So as you guys are learning how to build, AI with essentially the ability to create this massive shared language, how do you guys differentiate and make sure that there's no bias that starts to exist in it? And how do you protect against biases in this shared language?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. Not only because I love the kind of potentially mythological or theological implications, but also because it's just so real today. As you see these unified approaches to language become more powerful, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how that will affect kind of the power balance between different languages. And so the world divides into high resource languages and low resource languages. So languages we have a lot of data for, we can feed into the systems, and languages we don't. So we have this conversation sometimes. In fact, I try to propose this, would it be better if everybody did just speak English?
I don't know.
I think that's an interesting question because you could argue that, everything would be so much more efficient. Communication, information would flow so much more easily. What if we never had to translate anything? What if we all, on some level, thought the way that English structures our thinking? If you think like I do, philosophically, that your language does inform also how you think.
Well, let me stop you there for just a second, because my mind would say maybe English is not a sufficient enough language to be able to communicate who we are, what we believe, and why we believe it.
A lot of time I get the answer, that would just be more efficient. It'd be better. And I'm like, I'm surprised when I hear that, because for me, I feel like English doesn't always represent my thoughts or my state 100% precisely or accurately. And we know that there are other languages with other words. Those words provide kind of access to a conceptual breakdown of the world that we don't have.
The Greek, I'd like to stay on the Bible topic for a minute. Oftentimes people will say, well, the Greek word here is this, and we're trying to explain that Greek word with these, English words, and it may not get the full ethos of the meaning.
So there's this trade-off between some sort of efficiency of communication, which I think is superficially kind of, for some people it feels good, because then you could maybe build a Tower of Babel, right? You could be unified and you could be very easily coordinated. But there's also this other consideration of maybe coverage over our internal states, or maybe just like the universe, right? That if you were to reduce everything down to one language, it seems like you would lose something. You would lose representational power.
Yeah. And is that, in your mind, is that essentially the argument of like, okay, unity can exist without uniformity?
I think that's a nice way to describe it. Yeah. And maybe, but I don't know how it's going to play out. Like, I don't know to what extent the kind of the current dynamics will encourage one dominant language over time. And whether that language, some future version of the languages we have now, maybe some unified version, will be somewhere in between. It'll have more coverage. I'm not sure. But I know I don't have like 12 words for different kinds of snow. And to me, if like we just lost that language, it would represent some loss to me. Even when I'm like reading Latin, I liked to kind of read the original Latin of stories like the Aeneid from Virgil and stuff like that. It hits different, like it feels different when you read it. English translations are just such a poor approximation for the experience I have when I'm reading the actual Latin. So I don't really want that world, but I can see how some of the really large, unified, powerful approaches to language kind of encourage us to go in that direction, just because they're so data hungry.
Yeah.
So you're going to keep squeezing more out of languages that have more data.
Yeah, and
then there's bias against the languages that aren't represented.
Totally. And so just real quick on this topic, and then we can move on.
Yeah.
There's obviously different groups of people. There's different languages, but then there's also different groups of people within those languages that subscribe to different beliefs about certain things. 100%. And so how are you all in this process making sure that we're not trying to force everyone into a unified belief structure or knowledge structure that has some areas to where you can, as an individual, as a human, have some variances in what you believe and why you believe it?
Yeah, this is exactly where that kind of bias variance trade-off comes in. You'll notice that a lot of the foundational models they'll lean away from making really concrete prescriptions. You can sometimes get them to, but a lot of the times they'll lean away from it. And especially in what we're doing with U.com, I've been really interested more in like our deeper research modes of using these techniques, and that optimizes more for comprehensiveness rather than maybe conciseness. It's accurate, but we're optimizing more for representing all of the views out there than saying which one is correct.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable trade-off just on that level, that if you can keep it at the forefront of your mind to optimize for comprehensiveness, optimize for representing the views, also optimize for attributing what like a model would say to sources. So that's so you can kind of track where that's coming from those linguistic communities or those people, those value systems. I think that's a good way to go versus something like a really short, concise, almost Google-like answer.
This is the meaning of
this
life.
Is it. This is it. And you can see, you're bringing up the point that there's an issue with that. And I think we've seen that for like 20 years, right? People more and more over time, not everybody, but broadly speaking, people have almost treated Google like God.
Yeah, like
as a source of information.
The first or second result is the truth.
That's the truth.
And it's skewed in a lot of
times. And it is
skewed.
And it is biased. And so if we have an opportunity to shift that and maybe see user behavior change, the way it has been changing, instead of just typing in keywords, getting an answer, assuming that's the truth, towards prompting and then maybe engaging in a conversation, getting a very comprehensive, but not getting the answer directly, getting a food for thought, getting the next like layer of information. It actually saves you a ton of time, probably makes you more effective at whatever you're trying to do. So I think it actually is better in the long run, but it feels different for people.
And I think there's an element of like your knowledge grows. And you mentioned earlier, like belief is a part of knowledge, right?
Yep.
Your knowledge grows by what you believe whenever you have outside perspectives at what other beliefs there are that you can benchmark against it. And so I hear what you're saying. Like if with U.com, it's one of the things I really like about your tool is that there is the research mode and it's giving you back information. It's giving you back things so that you can come to the conclusion on what knowledge you want to subscribe to and what you believe about the subject. And I think that's super powerful. And it really kind of leads me to, like generative AI, right? One thought from a creative perspective and something that recently happened, I'd love to get your thoughts on because it kind of sounds in the similar vein. There was this Figma, right? They put out this new AI, make your design, button. And then all of a sudden there was this controversy that if you were to put in make a weather app, it would look just like the Apple weather app. Right. And so they took it down and they've now brought it back up as a first draft. And so like, how are these generative AI tools in your mind and in the ways that you're wanting U.com to help support these items are like, this is your first step in reaching a conclusion or a creation of humanity, not just relying on the creation and the end piece that AI spits out to you?
Yeah, it's there's kind of two paths there as well, and we're walking down both of them. One is you do want to try to do as much work as possible for your user. So that is something that we're doing, right? As much as I can, trying to automate workflows for users, whether that's designing an app or building an app or making a decision about whether to invest in a company, as we're working with VC firms and financial institutions, or what the right research to do next. If we work with biotech companies and we ingest a bunch of their prior research, we can suggest new research. So you do want to do a lot of that work for people, but at the same time, what I've been seeing is that in these deeper research use cases, typically the automation part is not the part that is giving people the most fulfillment, and that's not necessarily where a lot of the creativity is coming from. And so if you can, in some sense, like minimize the work that is least creative and give people more time to spend on the creative aspects and get that fulfillment, I think that's a win-win. It's probably not always as clear cut. I'm sure sometimes there are tasks that people like to do that AI will be better at than most people, probably an increasing number of people. There will still be some that are, the geniuses in that field and like the true artists or whatever you want to call them.
The Bryan McCanns and the Richard Sochers.
Yeah, right. And that will also still be true. But as AI gets better, I imagine some of that will happen. But it's true in a lot of things, right? Like the fact that, and it's been happening slowly but surely over time in a lot of areas. It's still fun to play games that AI can beat us at like very easily, and we can still get enjoyment out of it. I think there's an attachment that we have sometimes to maybe the economic value that is produced when you do that act. Those things are a little bit conflated right now.
I mean, you're seeing data analysts in some industries being minimized because of the power of AI. You're seeing junior roles in development being eliminated because of the power of AI. And so the real question just curious for you is, what does human and AI collaboration truly look like whenever we're lifting humanity not only just in what they can focus their time on, but also how they provide value to the world and how they can earn money in the world and all those types of things. Because there's this like shifting nature. It seems like this fight between we love AI and we want AI to be great, but what does that actually mean for humanity as AI rises in ability?
Yeah, it's, you know, one of my original goals for AI when I was starting out was, my whole thesis was we should have a unified model for language, for vision, for everything. And the more I worked on it, I started building these models in search of meaning. And I didn't see any meaning there. You know, you can't, if you build a neural network, you know, you can't be like, oh, there is the meaning. It's just like, it kind of does something that looks like meaning to us. And then when I did my work on actually making unified models start looking like they could do the job, I started feeling like all of these tasks that we had created, sentiment prediction, translation, they're like not real in some sense. They're just things that we broke down so that we could understand them. But a model doesn't need to have that sense of a task baked in. So these concepts start to dissolve. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I started to think that like there's a potential future where AI is better at every task. If we think of like our current conception of tasks, it's just better at everything. Like there is that potential. And part of me for a while was like that should be the goal, at least from a science and technology perspective, just everything. If it's running or sending emails, you know, if you take the best human at it and the maybe the learning rate at which they learned how to do that, the goal should be to make an AI that can learn to do it better, faster. And then does that apply to having a conversation? Does that apply to being a close friend? What about a romantic partner?
Right.
You know, and some of this gets sci-fi, right?
Does it though? Because those things are already happening, right?
They're already happening.
Yeah, like the romantic AI partners.
Yeah.
You're, you know, confiding in close friends. It's just an AI. Those things are already happening. So I don't think it's as sci-fi as...
It's not, it's maybe not as fictional as we think. But you could imagine even more extremes. And I don't have an answer to, you know, what it's like looking in the neural network and be like, where's the meaning? You know, looking into this situation where an AI is theoretically better at everything than any particular human, which is a much stronger kind of version of AGI than, say, OpenAI proposes or others, right? They're mostly focused on economic value or doing everything that a human could do with a computer.
Yeah.
This is saying everything. Like an AI could do it better. If we lived in that world, where would the humanity be?
Yeah, because that's kind of my question. That's like, that I just imposed to you is like, what makes a human human?
And I don't think we know. But I find it incredibly exciting that we might be able to find out. Because what I think that does show us is that many of the things that we use to define human aren't actually innately human. Which implies that like we haven't found it yet. All of the ways that most of us get value and identify with work or our roles or whatever they are, maybe those aren't the things that are really, at the end of the day, what make us human. That's what we currently feel is human.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something even more. When we couldn't beat computers at chess anymore, we felt a little bit like, well, okay, what are we here for? Like what? And it turned out we were fine, right? We just had to go through a little bit of an existential crisis, or some of us did. You go through your existential crisis, and then and the world is kind of flattened in terms of meaning for a while, but then you recreate it. And maybe that's what we're really good at.
Yeah.
That's my hypothesis, that we're really good at creating new meaning. I haven't had language models like, they're very good at learning our language, but I haven't had them, live a human experience and then be better at creating new language for it.
For you as a philosophy major, right? We use the example of the Tower of Babel. Let's stay on that same theme.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got the creation story in Genesis, right? You see God creating, right? And then you see him create man, and then you see him create woman, right? And then he says, work the garden and make it better, right? So like the first command from God to humanity was to work and make it better, increase, right? And so like, how do you, in that context, how do you separate humanity from what the Bible would say is the first command, which is to work and make it better, from AI being better at that than humanity?
I think our sense of work will probably just have to shift, is what I would imagine. I think that's what we typically do, right? There's a lot of jobs that used to exist. They don't really need to exist anymore. And, probably no one could have imagined that social media influencers existed.
Innovation brings new industry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we're very good at sometimes is going out and creating gardens wherever there needs to be a garden, and making work. And I imagine we'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
But I think but with every technical milestone, there's this confrontation we have with these deep stories of like going back to Tower of Babel, even like social media. You see a similar linguistic thing happening where you put everybody on Twitter or X, and suddenly you have people with different values, different beliefs, different languages, different expectations about what proper discourse looks like. Yeah. And it's no wonder that sometimes it devolves into madness or it turns into chaos, or people can't really talk to each other. They're not just, even when they're speaking English, they're kind of talking a different language. Even when it's English, technically, they come from such different value systems, different belief systems, that those word vectors they're shifted enough that they don't mean the same thing. And you can talk past each other, you can talk against each other very easily. My hope is that if that showed us the chaos of the confusion of having different languages, even down to the level of like linguistic communities within a language, then maybe AI can unite that a little bit. Yeah, I just find that really exciting.
I think that's cool. And I think too, every major industrial jump or technological jump that's happened throughout humanity, there's obviously portions of humanity that gets impacted from that. But I don't think that's enough of a reason to not try to advance everything as a whole.